Hi, and thanks for joining me. So in this video, I want to give a really quick overview of the origins of the American Constitution, so that we can begin from here to talk a little bit more in detail about American civil liberties and what they are and how they fit into the broader debate over the American Constitution and how we should interpret it. Now, a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about here are covered in much greater depth in some lectures on American history or the history of the Constitution. The point here is, again, to kind of give a broad strokes overview, specifically so that we can put civil liberties in context. So I want to talk about two things. First of all, I want to talk about where we get the idea of a constitution. Why does the United States think about constitutions, and why does the United States think that a constitution like the one we developed in 1789, ratified in 1789, what do we think it makes sense? And then also really quickly talk about what the ideas are that go into the American Constitution that are going to cause a lot of the problems that ultimately lead to the need to think about the importance of civil liberties. Now, first of all, you can certainly think about a constitution going all the way back to the Aristotelian Greek analysis of what constitutions are and their importance, and the reason why we need to create good laws to govern human behavior rather than simply having men governing behavior. But from our constitutional tradition, we really need to start with the British political system and how the British political constitution has evolved over time. Now, it's important to note the British system, they don't have a formal written constitution like ours. Instead, what they have are several legal documents or pieces of legislation that are considered to be fundamental laws. A couple of these that are going to be really important to our history are going to be the Magna Carta, 1215, and the Bill of Rights, 1689. What these two documents effectively do is, first for nobility and then for more of a middle class, they start to set up what the rights and responsibilities are of someone other than the king. Basically saying that the monarch has certain responsibilities and obligations to its nobles or to its citizens, but at the same time that there are certain freedoms that are enjoyed by their citizens, certain protections, certain things that the citizens can do that the monarch can't take away from them. Now, as we are drafting and redrafting our colonial charters, many of the concepts that are found in the Magna Carta or in the Bill of Rights end up getting put into our colonial charters. And these charters are going to be very important because when it comes time to ratify in our own US Constitution in 1789, we're going to base a lot of it on some of the principles and precepts that have already been adopted in the various states through their colonial charters and then their state constitutions. Now, finally, there's also another document that bears some mentioning, which is the Articles of Confederation. Before we were a federation that we are today, we were initially a confederation, something that was arranged more similarly to the Confederacy that ultimately lost the Civil War. And just like the Confederacy, our confederation, the National Confederation and the Articles of Confederation, had some internal flaws, some problems, if you will, some things that kept it from operating effectively. A few of these: there was no common coin guaranteed to be in circulation around the country. States could create their own. Many banks had their own. There was no formal way to tax or ensure income for the national government. They could ask for money from the states. They could say, pretty please. And if the states were in a good mood, they might actually send some of it forward if they felt like they should. It was difficult to establish a common foreign policy. Individual states often thought they could do it themselves. There's no uniform system for weights and measures under the Articles of Confederation, no interstate commerce clause, any way for the national government to regulate interstate commerce. There was no court system under the Articles of Confederation. So if you passed a law at the national level, it is ultimately up to the state courts to determine whether they should be enforced upon their citizens. There was an executive committee, but it wasn't anything like having a monarch or a prime minister under the British system. States were not compelled to do much of anything. There was no standing army. And in the face of all this, these internal problems of the document, there are a number of external problems that the country had to deal with, and it ultimately couldn't. The fact that the British never left some parts of American territory, the Barbary Pirates, if you're familiar with the Marine fight song, Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, and then also the problem of what do we do about the Indians. The British government had a treaty with the Indians on the western side of the Appalachian Mountains, basically saying that Europeans would never go there. And so when Europeans started to go there, they had to figure out what are we going to do with the Indians that are located in the Northwest Territories. So all of these problems existed under our national confederation, and we decided we had to do something about it. First, some delegates were sent to Annapolis in Maryland, and their goal was to sit down and figure out how to make some changes to the Articles of Confederation to make them better. And then they realized had a problem. It was not possible to change the Articles of Confederation. Nothing in the document allowed that to happen. So they decided to go back, ask for more directions, and they formed a second convention, this time in Philadelphia in 1787. And it is at this Philadelphia Convention that we consider to be the birthplace of the current American Constitution. But when the delegates arrived, they realized that there were even more problems than just how do you amend the darn thing. For example, many of the delegates who were sent were really concerned about the people who they were their fellow citizens. They didn't trust them very much. There's also some very deep factionalization between members of societies within countries. There were debates about how much power should go to the national government versus the states, and even questions about what does it mean to be a state and what states should be under this new system. Battles between the stronger, bigger, wealthier states and the weaker, smaller states, conflicts between the northern states, where the economy was increasingly based upon mercantile goods and trade, as opposed to the southern colonies, which were largely about the slave trade and agricultural products that were produced through slavery. And then also real debates about what does it mean to be a citizen and what privileges do we have. And all of these messes were laid on the table of the delegates in Philadelphia. Now, I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time talking about these in great detail. Again, you can find that discussion of how this debate went down elsewhere. But what I will tell you that's relevant to our later debate, our later discussion of civil liberties, was that we got out of all of these problems through a series of compromises. Many people often assume, and the Federalist Papers try to make it seem like, we created a constitution that was a whole and united, a logical solution to our problems. In reality, it's not so much a logical solution as it is a series of compromises to very practical problems that we had to deal with. Now, some of these are pretty well known. Things like the separation of powers and checks and balances, a way of making sure the government had all the power that it needed, and yet at the same time, it was going to be difficult to abuse that power. Did a few things in this Constitution. Some compromises were reached that allowed us to determine what the role of the national government was as opposed to the roles of the state governments. Wrote something called the Supremacy Clause that said that if the national government is empowered to do something, that its rules are superior, its constitution is superior to the states. The Interstate Commerce Clause, which is relatively important, basically says that all commerce between states and ultimately between the United States and other countries ultimately falls under the power of the national government. Something called the Necessary and Proper Clause, which basically argues that anything that it is necessary for the government to do can be properly done under the Constitution. If the government has the power to do something, it is ultimately up to the government to determine how it's going to do it. Also, in Article 1, we find there are a number of delegated authorities, things that are basically said these are the powers that are going to be given to the national governments by the states to ensure that the national government has sole responsibility for these. Created a Supreme Court. We also have a separate section of the Constitution called Article 4 that lays out what the responsibilities of the states are to one another. We create things like interstate compacts, or making those illegal without congressional approval. We make sure that the states have to recognize the full faith and credit of each other's laws and constitution. We make sure that criminals in one state can be extradited to another state or called back from a state if they try to flee there. And we make sure that the privileges and immunities guaranteed to citizens of the state are recognized to other American citizens who are visiting that state. And we do all of these things as a way of trying to establish what our new American political system will be. We create some compromises between strong states, the bigger states, and the smaller, weaker states, like ensuring we have a bicameral legislature, that the president is outside of the college, that the electoral college picks the president rather than Congress does. The bicameral legislature, one house is going to favor the big states, one house is going to favor the small states. The compromises between the North and the South, which are all about ensuring that import tariffs are okay, but export tariffs are not, and that ensure that the institution of slavery is going to be allowed to continue, something which is really important to the South. Now, all of that being true, what we really didn't spend a lot of time in the National Constitution is trying to figure out what exactly were the rights of citizens. We knew that if a citizen had some rights in a state, that all other American citizens in that state enjoyed those rights. But the Constitution does not say much about what the privileges of a citizen should be as they relate to the national government. We know that we're supposed to have a jury trial in criminal cases. That's mentioned in the main body of the Constitution. But it's not really until the negotiation about the Constitution, not really until some deals are struck to ensure its ratification, that we ultimately find a way to negotiate what sorts of individual freedoms and liberties we as American citizens will have. Now, our founding fathers, they didn't really think that we had to go through this. In fact, they were a little bit worried about installing or institutionalize freedoms and liberties into the national constitution. They thought that the states would take care of their own citizens. They thought that there needed to be a concern over the public good and the national interest, and not individual citizens or rights in the national constitution. But in reality, most people were very, very suspicious of the national government, and they wanted to make sure that the national government did not get too much power, and that it wasn't the state's responsibility, but rather the individual citizen's responsibility to make sure that you have rights. So this is where we ultimately get the Bill of Rights, the 10 amendments that vest for us the civil rights and civil liberties, especially the civil liberties that we've come to expect from our government. And it is going to be a discussion of the civil liberties that we will be engaging in over the rest of the semester. So thank you very much for joining me, and I hope you get some